July 7th, 1968. The day Bumpy Johnson died, Frank Lucas received a phone call at 6:47 in the morning. 2 words: he's gone. Frank sat on the edge of his bed for 20 minutes without moving. His wife Eva asked him what was wrong 3 times before he answered. When he finally spoke, all he said was, "I need to go to 416 Lenox Avenue." Eva knew the address. Everyone in Harlem knew it. It was one of Bumpy's old buildings, a 3-story walk-up with a barber shop on the ground floor and apartments above. Frank had been inside maybe twice in 15 years, both times just to collect rent from the barber. There was nothing special about the building, nothing that would make you look twice. The brick was faded, the windows rattled when trucks drove past. It looked like every other building on the block. That was the point. Frank drove through empty streets. Harlem was still asleep. He parked in front of 416 Lenox and sat in the car for a few minutes, smoking a cigarette, watching the building like it might tell him something. Bumpy had called him 3 nights before he died. Not to say goodbye. Bumpy didn't do goodbyes. He'd said, "Frank, if anything happens to me, you go to 416 Lenox, 2nd floor, back apartment. There's a floorboard under the radiator in the bedroom. You'll know which one." Frank had written it down on the back of a receipt and put it in his wallet. He hadn't asked questions. When Bumpy gave you instructions, you didn't ask why. You just listened. The barber shop was locked. Frank went around to the side entrance. The door was unlocked. It always was. He climbed the stairs slowly. The building smelled like old wood and radiator heat and cooking grease from someone's breakfast. Normal sounds, forgettable sounds. The 2nd floor hallway had 3 doors. The back apartment was the smallest one, the one nobody wanted because it faced the alley and got no sunlight. Frank knocked out of habit. No answer. He tried the knob. Unlocked. Inside, the apartment was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of furniture, of belongings, of anything that suggested someone lived there. Just bare walls and a wooden floor and radiator under the window in the bedroom. Frank knelt down next to the radiator. The floor was old hard wood, scratched and stained from decades of use. He pressed his hand against the boards, testing each one. The 3rd board from the wall didn't sit flush with the others. It had a gap, barely visible. Frank pulled a screwdriver from his jacket pocket and worked the board loose. It came up easier than it should have. Underneath was a space about 2 feet long and maybe 8 inches deep. Inside were 3 canvas bags, the kind banks used for coin transport in the 1950s. Frank opened the first one. Cash. Stacks of $100 bills, bundled with rubber bands and wrapped in plastic. He didn't count it. He didn't need to. Each bag held $1 million, $3 million total. Bumpy's life savings, hidden under a floorboard in a building nobody cared about. Frank sat back against the wall and lit another cigarette. He thought about Bumpy, about the way he'd operated for 40 years without ever getting caught with serious money. The police had raided Bumpy's house a dozen times over the decades. They'd searched his car, his office, his friends' houses. They'd frozen his bank accounts, audited his taxes, followed him for months. They never found anything. Not because Bumpy didn't have money, because Bumpy understood something law enforcement didn't. People look for secrets in secret places. They search basements and attics and hidden safes. They assume that if something is valuable, it must be protected by locks and guards and layers of security. Bumpy knew that the best hiding place wasn't a place nobody could find. It was a place nobody thought to look. When Frank walked out of 416 Lenox that morning, he left the money exactly where it was. He didn't take it. Not yet. He replaced the floorboard, made sure it sat the same way it had before, and locked the apartment door behind him. Then he went home and waited. 3 days later, the FBI came to his apartment. They wanted to ask him questions about Bumpy Johnson's estate. Frank told them the truth. Bumpy didn't leave a will. didn't have much in the bank, died owing more than he owned. The agents didn't believe him, but they couldn't prove otherwise. Over the next 8 years, the FBI would search 416 Lenox Avenue 52 times. Frank kept count. The first search happened 2 weeks after Bumpy died. 4 agents, a warrant, and a locksmith. They started in the basement, then moved to the barber shop, then went through the apartments one by one. The back apartment on the second floor was vacant. They spent an hour in there, opened cabinets, looked under the sink, checked the radiator. But they didn't pull up the floorboards. Why would they? The apartment was empty. No reason to think anything valuable was hidden in a place with no security, no locks, no protection. The second search came 3 months later with drug dogs, German shepherds trained to detect cash by the ink and paper scent. The dogs alerted twice in other parts of the building, but not in the back apartment. The money was sealed in plastic, wrapped tight, buried under wood. The scent didn't reach them. By the 5th search, the building's tenants were complaining. The barber called his city councilman. The searches slowed down, but didn't stop. In 1970, the FBI brought in structural engineers. They wanted to check for hidden rooms, false walls, spaces that didn't match the building's blueprints. They found discrepancies, but nothing useful. They tore open walls looking for hidden spaces, found nothing but old insulation and rat nests. They checked the back apartment again, measured the room dimensions, everything lined up. They wrote in their report that the building posed no further investigative value. 3 months later, a different FBI team came back and searched it again. Frank didn't touch the money for 2 years. He let it sit under that floorboard while the FBI tore the building apart around it. He watched from a distance, heard the stories, saw the frustration building in the agents' faces when they came up empty every time. He understood what was happening. They were looking for a secret. They were looking for something hidden behind false walls or buried under concrete or locked in a vault. They assumed that $3 million would be protected, secured, locked away in a place that required effort to access. So they searched everywhere that required effort. They never thought to check under a loose floorboard in an empty apartment that anyone could walk into. Because why would you hide $3 million in a place with no locks, no security, no protection? The answer was simple. You wouldn't hide it there. You'd leave it there. And there's a difference. In 1971, after the searches had stopped for 6 months, Frank finally moved the money. Not all at once. He took one bag at a time over 6 months, replacing the cash with bundled newspapers wrapped in plastic so the weight would feel the same. One bag went under the floorboards of a community center in Sugar Hill. The second went into a storage closet at a church on 145th Street. The third stayed at 416 Lenox for another year, just to see if anyone was still watching. Nobody was. By 1972, Frank Lucas had built an empire on the foundation Bumpy left him. The $3 million became $30 million. The heroin pipeline from Vietnam was running smoothly. Frank had crews in 5 states and political connections that reached into City Hall. And the entire time, the FBI was still trying to figure out where Bumpy's money had gone. They interviewed Frank twice more, asked him directly if Bumpy had left him anything. Frank said no, because technically Bumpy hadn't left him anything. He'd just told him where to look. That distinction mattered to Frank. It meant he wasn't lying. He was just answering the wrong question. The feds operated on assumptions. They assumed criminals protected their assets. They assumed money meant security, meant locks and layers and paranoia. They assumed that someone like Bumpy Johnson, who'd survived 40 years in the drug trade, would have a sophisticated system for hiding wealth. And they were right. Bumpy did have a sophisticated system. It just wasn't the one they were looking for. Bumpy's system was built on a single principle. Don't hide things where people search. Leave them where people walk past every day without noticing. The barber shop at 416 Lenox stayed in business for another 15 years. The building changed ownership 3 times. The back apartment on the second floor eventually got rented to a city school teacher who lived there for 8 years and never knew she was sleeping 15 feet away from where $3 million had been hidden. She probably walked over that exact floorboard 1,000 times, complained once to the building super that the floor creaked near the radiator. He told her old buildings make noise. She never mentioned it again. In 1975, when Frank Lucas was finally arrested, the feds went back to 416 Lenox one more time. They were convinced they'd missed something. They brought in a forensic team, pulled up every floorboard in the building, tested for trace evidence of cash. They found traces in the basement, in the barber shop, in 2 of the apartments, but they found nothing in the back apartment on the 2nd floor. The floorboard had been replaced. Frank had done it himself in 1972, pulled the old board and installed a new one that matched the others. The feds tested the new board. Clean. They wrote in their report that Bumpy Johnson likely died with minimal assets, that his reputation for wealth was exaggerated. They were wrong, but their assumptions made them blind. Frank Lucas spent years in prison thinking about that floorboard, about how something so simple had worked so well, about how the feds had searched the same building 52 times and never thought to check the most obvious place. It wasn't because they were incompetent. The agents were smart, trained, experienced, but they were trained to think like investigators. They looked for complexity because complexity suggested guilt. A loose floorboard in an unlocked apartment wasn't complex. It was careless, and careless criminals get caught. Except Bumpy Johnson was never careless. He was deliberate. He understood that the human mind skips over things that seem too easy. If it's not protected, it must not be valuable. If it's accessible, it must not be important. What Bumpy understood, and what took Frank years to fully appreciate, was that invisibility isn't about hiding in the shadows. It's about standing in plain sight and becoming part of the landscape. The building at 416 Lenox Avenue wasn't a secret location. It was a tax record, a rental property, a place where people got haircuts and paid rent and complained about the heat in winter. It existed in official documents, in city files, in the ordinary bureaucracy of urban life. That's what made it invisible. The FBI could search it 52 times because it was never off limits, never suspicious enough to warrant permanent surveillance. It was too mundane to be dangerous, and that mundanity was the perfect camouflage. Bumpy had hidden $3 million not by making it unreachable, but by making it unremarkable. The lesson Frank carried with him, even after prison, even after everything fell apart, was this: power doesn't survive by being impenetrable. It survives by being uninteresting. The moment something looks like it matters, people start paying attention. They start asking questions. They start searching. But if you can make your power look ordinary, routine, forgettable, then you can operate in the open without anyone noticing. Bumpy had done it for 40 years. Frank had done it for 5. The difference wasn't skill or intelligence. It was patience. Bumpy knew when to be boring. Frank learned too late that being flashy, being noticed, being someone people talked about was the beginning of the end. A chinchilla coat at a boxing match. That's all it took. One moment of visibility, and everything unraveled. When Frank got out of prison in 1981, he went back to 416 Lenox Avenue one last time. The barbershop was still there, under new ownership. The building looked the same. He walked up to the 2nd floor and stood outside the back apartment. Someone was living there now. He could hear a television through the door. He didn't knock. He just stood there for a minute, remembering the morning he'd pulled up that floorboard and found 3 canvas bags that changed his life. Then he walked back down the stairs and left. He never went back. Years later, a reporter asked Frank Lucas how Bumpy Johnson had managed to stay ahead of law enforcement for so long. Frank thought about it for a while before answering. He said, "Bumpy knew that people don't see what they're not looking for, and if you make them look for the wrong thing, they'll walk right past what's real." The reporter asked if that was a strategy Frank had used himself. Frank smiled and said, "I learned from the best." He didn't say anything else, because the real answer wasn't something you could explain. It was something you had to understand by watching. The FBI closed their investigation into Bumpy Johnson's assets in 1979. They concluded that whatever money he'd accumulated had disappeared, likely moved offshore or hidden in ways they couldn't trace. The file listed 416 Lenox Avenue as a searched location, flagged as clean. 52 visits, thousands of man-hours, and in the end, they were standing on the answer the entire time. The money was never the secret. Knowing where not to look was.